Hello, good morning.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
All right. How are you?
Great. Hope all is well. We are joined. We have the honor to be joined by Dr. John Efron, who is the author of many one of the extremely interesting books that he has published. One of which really caught my interest. It's called The Allure, German Jewry and the Allure of the Sephardic. He's the professor of Jewish history at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of many other books as well. Today, we're going to be talking about this specific book. So, first of all, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Okay. Let me first start out by asking you, what got you interested in this specific topic? And can you tell us like a brief outline of what this book is about for the viewers?
Yeah, sure. Actually, it's a book. It's called German Jewry and the Allure of the Sephardic, but it's a book about Ashkenazic identity, modern Ashkenazic identity. And it started. I've written previous books on medicine and on the way Jews were represented in race, and so I've always been in race science and race thinking, and in medicine, and I've always been interested in the way the Jewish body and Jewish appearance has been represented and depicted by both non-Jews but also by Jews. So that's just one interest that's always been in my scholarship and my research. But as you can hear, I have an accent. And so when I came to the United States many, many years ago, and I started attending Seder's at people's places, I would notice, this is sort of in the 1980s, I would notice they would be serving, when it came to Seder, they would be serving some kind of Sephardic charoset or something like that. And people would make a very big deal with this. We were having Iraqi this year, or at another person's place, we're having Moroccan or something like that. And it occurred to me that if you were at a Sephardic place, no self-respecting Sephardic family would say, we're serving Ashkenazi charoset this year. And this is not very scientific, but I think it's pretty true. And so I was curious as to, it was about an Ashkenazic loss of identity, having lost touch with, I guess, with their European roots, having lost touch with food culture and things like that. And that was sort of one of the things that sort of got into my head years ago. Where did this fascination among Ashkenazim with Sephardic culture come from? And so that's what this book is about. And I traced the beginnings of this fascination that Ashkenazim have with Sephardic culture, and a belief that that it was superior, but most importantly in an aesthetic sense, that Sephardim were more elegant, were more refined, had better manners, were not as coarse, etc., etc. It really stems from Germany in the 18th century.
Yeah,
and that's what the book is about, the development of that trope.
Right. So this concept, this trope, as you call it, was very much in vogue. Began to kind of explode on the scene during the Enlightenment period with the purveyors of Haskalah, Moses Mendelssohn disciples.
Yep.
When do we see? Because it's kind of interesting. Because on the one hand, you have the purveyors of Haskalah like Mendelssohn, who do express their pride and their Ashkenazi antecedents and culture. They're not saying that they're inferior. At least they're not, displaying an inferiority complex. The same goes for, I guess, his immediate disciples. So when do you start actually seeing, I guess, Maskilim or Jewish enlighteners or people of that nature saying we need to emulate the Sephardim? They had a good model that we should follow because our way has failed.
Yeah. Mendelssohn was not a purveyor of a sense of Sephardic superiority, so he was a little bit unusual in that sense. It begins. What happens is that I think the driving political force is that in Poland was divided three times in the 18th century. 1772, 1773, and 1772, 1793, and 95. And it was carved up between Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And what that meant was that Prussia inherited a very, very large number of Polish Jews. And so those Polish Jews came into contact with German Jews. And it made them look. German Jewry, especially German Jewry that was focused in that was residing in Berlin, was a very small number, about 3,500, to a great extent wealthy, to a great extent culturally integrated, although not socially integrated to a great extent. And this very large number of Polish Jews that come in contact with German Jews, and particularly sort of upper crust German Jews, leads to an evaluation and a fear that the presence of these Polish Jews could set back the whole process of emancipation and integration and acculturation. And so there becomes a concerted effort to not emulate the Sephardim. I mean, German Jewry didn't want to be anything else except German Jews. It wasn't like they were going to try and pretend to be Sephardic Jews, but they saw in Sephardic Jewry a model of integration through the way they perceived Sephardic Jewry, which was itself a distortion that Sephardic Jewry itself helped perpetuate, and the Ashkenazim. So, I mean, it was as if every Sephardic Jew, I mean, from the Golden Age, from between 900 and 1100, it was if every Sephardic Jew was a Hebrew grammarian or a courtier or a doctor. Well, that's not obviously, a great rabbi or a biblical exegete. That's obviously not the case. Most of them, like everyone in the Middle Ages, were illiterate, but they did have some, really stellar figures. And so that image of Sephardic Jewry, which is a very small intellectual elite, became a stand-in for all Sephardic Jews. And so, and by the 18th and 19th century, it was incredibly strong. It was the German Jews, the members of a group called the Wissenschaft des Judentums, which was the academic study of Judaism, basically those who invented essentially modern Jewish studies. They were the ones who created this image of Sephardic Jewish, superiority in some respects, cultural superiority. And it had a very, very long lifespan. I think to some extent it's still with us. There are very few historical theories from 150 years ago that are still extant, but they created a very, very powerful narrative that was helped by such things as Zionism, because medieval Sephardic Jewry had a fantastic, obviously, and very rich and robust tradition of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew scholarship. And so that was attractive to the Zionist movement. So in schools, that aspect of their culture was perpetuated. But it all stems from this sort of 18th and early 19th century representation by German Jewish intellectuals that here was a model, and this especially comes later on, with the rise of Zionism at the end of the 19th century. Sephardic Jewry provided a model of German Jews of a successful, until it wasn't successful, but a successful diasporic community, not a community that felt the need to pack up and leave Europe, but one that had thrived and created, a stellar culture. And so that was a model for German Jews. We can be next in line, pick up the mantle.
Yeah, it's interesting because you have the Eastern European Maskilim also, of course, kind of going along with this.
Yep.
But sometimes you have and this goes to the sort of stratification and sometimes tension between the two communities when they encountered each other, which happened, of course, in the early modern period, where you had such a reshuffling of Jewish communities in the aftermath of massacres, the Chroniki massacres, and the Sabbatean movement. And you had what seemed to be a sort of, I guess, cooperation between the communities to some extent. You don't see that gratification until a little bit later, for instance, with the settling down of the Portuguese Sephardic community in Amsterdam, for instance, where the bylaw strictly stated that no Ashkenazim were allowed and no Sephardi member can marry a Tedesco, and if they do, which is the Italian, Spanish term for Ashkenazi, German, and if they do, they'd be kicked out, that kind of thing. So you see where, they kind of turn up their noses. And then you see that also later where even maskilim like Gottlober, for instance, Abraham Ber Gottlober, would travel around the different communities. When he came to Romania, which is, I want to talk about that more later, because it's basically the only Eastern European country that has a actually established Sephardic community in Bucharest. And he says, so originally he was very much an admirer of the Sephardim, but he kind of felt put off by the way he was being treated. He felt he was being treated as an inferior Ashkenazi. You see that a lot in various places and in various figures who were, at first, people, Ashkenazim, were very much taken in by it, but then when they met Sephardim, they were kind of insulted. They weren't being treated as equals. What are your thoughts on
that? I think that, look, there's no doubt that in 18th century Amsterdam, in 18th century London, there was real hostility on the part of the established Sephardic communities towards the Ashkenazi community. And you were absolutely right. I mean, if a Sephardic girl wanted to bring home an Ashkenazi boy for marriage, she was just told, you'll have no dowry. And that basically, since marriage is an economic arrangement, that essentially meant that it was off. When they did allow Ashkenazic children into their schools, the boys, mostly boys, had to sit on a bench at the very back of the classroom, sort of an Ashkenazic bench. They weren't allowed to be, just in the middle of the classroom with the other Sephardic pupils. So there was a real sense of contempt for Ashkenazim, although even by the 18th century, a significant percentage of Dutch Jewry, for example, of the Sephardic community, was already on what we call matzah relief, poor relief, where at Pesach time they would get matzah from the community. They were already economically poorer than the Ashkenazim in Amsterdam and in London as well. But nonetheless, they saw themselves as sort of the leaders of those communities for a while, anyway. So that's a later development. I mean, in the Middle Ages, by the way, before the expulsion, there was very little contact between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. There wasn't much intellectual contact. Sephardim had their rabbinical traditions, the Ashkenazim had theirs, but there was very little in the way of friction either. So when they did come in contact, no one made any, there's very little comment, for example, on, and this is an important part in my book, there's a chapter on Hebrew pronunciation. No one said the Sephardic one is better, the Ashkenazic one is worse, etc., until we get to the 18th century. Then it becomes a huge point, and it becomes a huge point among Zionists as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Sephardic pronunciation thing obviously grew out later, and I think this is something that hasn't been explored enough, because the Ashkenazi pronunciation was not homogeneous. It was not. There were various different pronunciations, and it appears that many Ashkenazim pronounced the Hebrew exactly as Sephardim, at least in the Middle Ages. It would appear that many communities in Germany and parts of France, there's more studies.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, you basically have, you have Ashkenazim from London all the way to Russia, and from Denmark all the way down to Italy. So there's just no way that they're ever going to. I mean, one of the things, just as an aside, there was a very fine scholar of Hebrew some years ago by the name of Louis Glynnett. And Louis Glynnett published, I think it was in the AJS Review, I might be wrong about that, but I think it was that, years ago, lamenting the loss, not of Hebrew, but the loss of Hebrews, of how many different kinds of Hebrew we lost when Zionism sort of settled on a pronunciation and made that normative and definitive. And we've lost a lot of traditions, even different kinds of Sephardic pronunciations as well. They weren't all uniform either. And most of those have been lost. But anyway, in the Middle Ages, there wasn't the story that I'm telling is really a story that begins in the 18th century. That there wasn't that much friction beforehand, but afterwards there is some view among scholars of Sephardic Jewry that it's in the post-expulsion period that Sephardic Jews sort of internalized Spanish, non-Jewish notions of Spanish superiority, and in a kind of a microcosm, projected those feelings of Spanish superiority, but in this case Sephardic superiority, onto their Ashkenazic brethren. And so that's where we see things like, exclusion in communities, different, refusal to allow burials of Ashkenazim in Sephardic cemeteries, and a general sense of Sephardic superiority. And that's a very interesting idea, that they may have internalized the very thing that led to them being kicked out of Spain to begin with. But
highly ironic, exactly. It's often the case where, more often than not, where Jews internalize notions of their host nations about them, and sometimes turn it around on its head.
Exactly, and it may also be, just to get back to something I mentioned just before, Joel, and that is the possibility that this comes about at a time when the power and authority and just the socioeconomic status of Sephardic Jewry is in decline in places like London and Amsterdam and Hamburg, vis-a-vis the Ashkenazim, and who were demographically greater already by the 18th century, and in socioeconomic, better shape socioeconomically. So that may also be tied to a sense of, their own decline, as it were.
Right. Let me talk about we focus a lot on that in the book, and this is something that I spent a lot of time researching. Many years ago, I came across a little booklet in the New York Public Library in Manhattan, where a Lithuanian Jew, Shlomo Katsav, wrote a list of families. The name of the booklet is called HaSephardim Asher Be'eretz Lita, the Sephardic Jews of Lithuania.
Really?
Yeah. And it's not a book. It was a booklet that someone typed up. Shlomo Katsav was a scholar, not very well known, but he was a scholar of Lithuanian origin. And he actually had a full list. And it really intrigued me, which kind of set me down on the road of discovering whether there were actually Sephardic Jews in places that would be very unlikely to find them, like Poland, Russia, Lithuania, Hungary, Romania, and places like that. And as you pointed out in the book, and also in private correspondence that we had, you mentioned that you were surprised how many normative Ashkenazic Jews claim to have Sephardic antecedents or be of Sephardic descent. They came from Spain and they ended up in Russia or Germany. There's always an interesting story there. And you are very dismissive of most, if not all, of these narratives. Am I right in that, or am I a little bit?
Well, I just think it's curious that I've never heard anyone boast by saying, my family originated in Eastern Europe or Poland. I've never heard anyone say that. Right. And I doubt that you have either. Right. So there's a pattern here. It's not to say that there were, even it's suggested, and I don't know that it's necessarily true, that the great Yiddish author Peretz was perhaps Perez. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but there were Sephardic Jews in Eastern Europe, but they very quickly moved into communities. I mean, in the 18th century already, Polish Jewry was about 750,000 strong. It was gigantic. It was sort of, just demographically, there was nothing to compete with it. So when Sephardim moved into if they came to Poland, they were very quickly, Ashkenazized, as it were. They adopted Ashkenazi. So it's not to say that there weren't Sephardic Jews, but we have no idea. I mean, Herzl made that claim. There was a famous author in Germany in the 1920s by the name of Jakob Wassermann. Jakob Wassermann, in his wrote a book called My Life as German and Jew. It came out in the 20s. All right. In the very beginning, his family is from a town in southern Germany called Fürth, and Fürth was where Henry Kissinger was from. It was a very important little trading town, and with a substantial Jewish community. You can still go to Fürth today and still see 19th century places where the mezuzahs were on the doors. So it was a real, important rural Jewish community in Germany. His family is from Fürth. He makes a case in this My Life as German and Jew in the preface that half of his family, he's quite sure, came from Spain after being expelled. Absolutely. I mean, it's just there's no way to prove it. It didn't happen, but it's highly unlikely. But this claim is a very, very common one, and that intrigues me. I find that fascinating that these Ashkenazim feel the need to establish their bona fides or their credentials, as if Ashkenazic Jewry in its millions and everything that it created as this rich, robust culture is not enough.
Okay.
It's insufficient.
Right. So that's definitely one thing that kind of gets people's goat, I guess, on both sides. I say this because I find that every time I mention an Ashkenazi person who claims Sephardic descent, and I'll mention a couple of more examples of that, it gets people going on both sides. It gets, especially I find that Sephardic Jews, Western Sephardic Jews, like Rafe Malhado, who runs one of these Sephardic groups on Facebook. So I posted something recently about a person that I don't know if you've heard of it, Samuel Jacob Haim Falk, who is known as the Baal Shem of London. His portrait is often mistaken as that of the Baal Shem Tov.
Okay.
And he apparently was a Sephardic Jew, at least his father was, but he did come from Poland. He was apparently born in Podaice, which was Ukraine, now Poland. He signed his name Laniado, so it's pronounced as Hebrew and Sephardic. He seemed, and in his diary he records Ben Raphael Sephardi. Emden mentions him as Ben Raphael Sephardi. I mean, it seems pretty clear he was of Sephardic parentage, yet obviously he was acculturated within the Ashkenazi society. He loved Kugel, for instance. He used Yiddish words. So he was kind of somewhere in between, but he was, I guess you can still call someone like that who still retains the cultural aspects of his heritage a sort of Sephardi Ashkenazi, unlike, let's say, it's Leibush Peretz, who his family did claim descent from the Jews who settled in Zamość, the Sephardic Jews settled in Zamość. But he is a Yiddish literary hero. I mean, it's ironic. But again, there's some like Samuel Niger in the Evil Annual calls him a Sephardic Ashkenazi Jew, and he marvels at that. So I think there's a difference there. Okay, if you want to say that Peretz, his Sephardiness has already been diluted over so many years. Okay, but here's a guy who is in the early 1700s, and he still retains some of that Sephardiness because he still obviously practices some of that. So when do you when do you make that judgment call? Like, no, this guy's not. So it rouses passions on both sides. And when I said that Peretz may have had Sephardic parentage, I had Israelis attacking me for that, saying that Peretz is not a Sephardic name. It has nothing to do with the Sephardic Peretz family. Peretz means pepper in Russian or something like that. They came up with all kinds of theories. And on the other hand, that, for instance, that Falk was Sephardic, they said, no, he wasn't. Oh, you have these proofs. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't make him Sephardic. He was completely Ashkenazi just because he had some Sephardic heritage. Many Ashkenazim have Sephardic heritage. What do you make of that? Why do people get
so yeah? It's fascinating. First of all, I don't. I just said we don't know, and Jewish records only go back so far. I mean, there aren't great Jewish records for the Middle Age. I mean, the Middle Ages, next to no one can trace their roots back. I mean, so it's just so there's no proof one way or the other, but I find it highly interesting, as I said, that everyone will claim that Ashkenazim will claim Sephardic stuff. No Sephardic Jew will ever claim that they came from Poland originally. That's the first thing. You've never heard that. You've never heard that.
I have. But okay.
Well, maybe okay, but generally, we're talking one or two. But generally, it's a proposition that doesn't exist, and among Ashkenazi Jews, you'll never hear any of them say something similar either. So I'm not making. I don't want to make the judgment. I'm just interested. I'm interested in the phenomenon, the fact that it's even said or it's felt necessary to be said. As far as Sephardic Jews who would take umbrage and say, Peretz is not Sephardic or Herzl's not Sephardic or something like that, whatever. That I think is really an expression, and they may not even be aware of it today because they're saying it today to you, of this notion of the Sephardi Tahor, the pure Sephardi, which is actually a kind of a quasi-biological notion. Because what does it mean if someone in the 18th or 19th century or 20th century who is demonstrably either an Ashkenazic Jew or just a Jew that is barely affiliated whatsoever? What does it mean that they're claiming Sephardi? I'll give you one of those. So you're mentioning some rabbis. I mentioned Herzl. Okay, those guys, we know. The famous British TV cook, Nigella Lawson. Nigella Lawson has claimed that one side of the family was Sephardic, was from Spain. Now, why? There's nothing that she does that is an expression of Sephardic culture whatsoever. So, what is it to be Sephardic? Is it a biological thing? What is it to be Ashkenazic? If she had said also, my family is from wherever, somewhere in Germany or Austria or Poland, but does nothing, what does that mean as well? So there are also biological notions, which is also, quite frankly, a very Spanish thing because of the Estatutos de Limpieza de Sangre, the statutes of the purity of blood. There was already in the pre-modern period this notion of Sephardi Tahor, and also the Spanish had their own sort of racist notion of what constitutes a real Spaniard. So it's a curiosity. It's a curiosity, but a feature of contemporary Jewish life. And by contemporary, as a historian from the 18th century, and you'll still hear it today by some people.
Netanyahu just recently said that he's Sephardic ancestry, for instance. Yeah. So it's nothing but it's interesting that you, I think, cast this more as so we're going back to the 18th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
Yeah.
17th and 18th centuries specifically, especially where you see this phenomenon a lot, but you also, and you cast this as more of a secular, I guess, a Wissenschaftliches phenomenon, but you do see it also in the ultra-Orthodox and religious communities with Hasidic Admorim, for instance. So
absolutely.
That also exists among ultra-Orthodox Jews to this day, by the way. Also many ultra-Orthodox Jews.
That's true. And, Hasidism will adopt, for example, Sephardic Nusach or something like that. But they are also very, very, they wave the flag of Ashkenazic culture as well.
Yes.
They admit, look, we adopted this in the 18th century. We don't trace our roots back to Spain. And so, they hold themselves out as the last great bastion of religious Ashkenazic culture. So they're in a special category of themselves. But I'm really interested in secular Jews for whom, basically Jews who have fallen away. And I could even include, Herzl was a highly acculturated Viennese Jew. And just the need to find some kind of antiquity or linkage and trace that to Sfarad is it's a fact of modern secular Jewish life. It gives you something that you've lost. It gives you an identity. It gives you, as I said before, some sort of Jewish bona fides.
Yeah, I guess definitely people are looking for that. I mean, there's all types of groups out there, and one of the groups called Sephardic Jews of Poland, and you have a lot of people coming in and saying they have a tradition of Sephardic descent. And what they're looking for, a lot of people in the 20s and 21st, there's always been the case, but I guess you have a lot of people who feel alienated, unmoored, looking for an identity. And maybe in some cases, and maybe in many cases, when they say that they have this tradition, maybe it's not completely bogus. Maybe it is based on facts. For instance, there was a family in Belarus and Lithuania and Latvia called the Don Yachya or Don Yachya family. I don't know if you've ever come across them. Early as the 1920s, well, we have documentation going back. but they were known in Yiddish as the Sephardic family in Latvia. That's what they called themselves, and that's what they were known as. It's just a fascinating phenomenon.
Yeah.
I mean, Don Yahya is definitely not a name that came out of Germany or France.
No. Exactly. So all just to get back to the book for just a moment.
Sure.
This allure, the Sephardic, which is what the title of the book is, this allure manifests in all sorts of ways, and so it manifests itself in terms of a belief in the correctness of Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew, or there are chapters on sort of bodily comportment. There's a chapter on synagogue architecture. In a whole host of ways, literature, popular novels. The very first secular novel in German appeared in Jewish novel appeared in Germany in 1837, and it's called The Muranos. Yeah. And had all these sort of highly melodramatic, page-turning, serialized novels that appeared in Jewish newspapers in Germany, and every week people would get their Jewish newspaper for the weekend on Erev Shabbos, and they would read it over the weekend. And these page-turning novels were all about not them. They were not reflected in it, but these tales, epic tales of Sephardic Jews during the Middle Ages. So in literature, in architecture, in language, in appearance, all these different topics, you see this phenomenon we're talking about, this desire to connect, this desire to adulate.
So what do you say about people today who have this position and are looking to reconnect or looking to adopt the Sephardic culture? I mean, can an Ashkenazi Jew, this is actually found in rabbinic responsa, an Ashkenazi Jew who is not religious and is not affiliated with any specific community, perhaps his parents came from Russia or Poland, and he wants to connect, he feels more of a connection to the Sephardic community, he wants to be a member and call himself Sephardic for all intents and purposes. Do you see that as a legitimate thing at all?
Oh, look, you can call yourself whatever you like. It doesn't necessarily make it so. So right. I'm not a policeman. I'm not here to police who's Jewish, who's not Jewish. Who's
thoughts on that is some people have nothing but derision for some people like that. But if Sephardic is a way of life and a culture, people join all kinds of movements and cultures and become acculturated into that movement. And that, to some extent, that happened throughout history, where people became Sephardic, they weren't.
And it worked the other way. That is to say, those Sephardim who went to Eastern Europe, and there were Sephardic Jews in Poland, in Zamość, for example. And let's just say it's 100% indisputable that Peretz had come from a Sephardic background.
Yes,
he became the great Zayda of Yiddish literature. So yes, you can become something else. Of course, you can absolutely become something else. Absolutely, but it's a different time. I mean, that world is no longer that sort of European Jewish world is no more. So, what does it mean when I went to one of my first seders, in New Rochelle or something when I arrived here, and the Charassot, as I said, I mean, this is a manifestation of it today. It sounds trite, but I came, for people who are watching this, you can probably hear, I'm from Australia. I grew up in Melbourne, which is a largely, Polish Jewish Yiddish speaking community. When I was a young kid, both refugees and Holocaust survivors. It was as Ashkenazic as you could get. And I actually really didn't. It was really quite monochromatic in that way. I mean, I really didn't know any Sephardic Jews until I would have encountered them in Israel when I first went to Israel, and then in the United States. So it was just impossible for me to imagine from that perspective of Melbourne Jewry of anything like that. People stuck to their Ashkenazic traditions. They were very proud of them. That was that. In America, where Jews had been here a lot longer. a couple generations longer, and had and the bulk of the community, by the way, as I said, were refugees or survivors. So they came. So it was really quite recent. In America, where they had been longer and certain identities had become attenuated. And I noticed this. So I just, as I say, coming from Melbourne, I noticed this phenomenon of serving food that was not one's own. And that's all fine. It's not a criticism, but it's a sort of thing that an anthropologist will take note of, to see the way people are celebrating Hagim. And this was a celebration, and food is a central element of Jewish holidays in general, but the Seder night in particular, and the introduction of foods that are clearly and demonstrably not of their own, from the well of their own culture. So it has something to do with distance. It has, and in the 18th century, I said it was also distance. What happened is that you have this encounter between Polish Jews, thanks to the partitions, and in fact Germany inherits, a couple 100,000 Jews in Prussia. You have this encounter between sort of upper class German Jews in Berlin, and then you have these Prussian Jews that they are now responsible for. And one way they didn't want to be mistaken for them. They didn't want to be lumped in together. And so what they tried to do, and what German Jewry actually did do as a result, in part, of this this attraction to Sephardic culture, which did not entail emulating Sephardic culture, but emulating the idea of Sephardic culture. That is to say, the way one should comport oneself. Literally, physically, and deportment, and bearing, and things like that. It all came about as a result of a desire to distance oneself from the great mass of Polish Jewry, who were different. And in the process, over the course from the 18th century on, German Jewry ended up creating an entirely new expression of Ashkenazi culture. They're Ashkenazim, but before the 18th century, there are local minhagim that denote differences, but there's a pan-Ashkenazi community that that marry among themselves. German Jewish boys are sent to Polish yeshivas. Polish Jewish boys are sent to Germany when they still had yeshivot. There's commerce, there's trade. They're both speaking Yiddish, differently accented, a Western Yiddish versus an Eastern Yiddish, but they're absolutely speaking in Yiddish, writing in Yiddish, etc., etc. And that begins to break down in the 18th century. And one contributing factor, or one aspect of the breakdown, let me put it this way. There are two major aspects of the breakdown. One, the advent of Hasidism does not cross the border for the most part into Germany. Second, German Jews slowly but surely stop speaking a Jewish language. They stop speaking Yiddish and adopt German. Those two things, Hasidism and the retention of Yiddish, make for the character to some extent, or two very important aspects of the character. There's more to it, of course, of Polish Jewry, and it differs from German Jewry. German Jewry goes off in its direction, but still an Ashkenazic direction, but one that appears very, very different, has a different look entirely to Eastern European Ashkenazic culture. So whereas they had both been part of a larger pan-Ashkenazic culture, it breaks off into two branches. And German Jewry breaking off, creating a new form of Ashkenazic culture, has one aspect of it, this adulation of Sephardic culture, that emerges in Eastern Europe among Zionists at the end of the 19th century, and takes on a slightly different form. They're less concerned with appearance. They're more concerned with maybe Hebrew pronunciation when they get to Eretz Israel. But there is some of it there, but for the most part, it's really a German phenomenon, and plays a very big role in making German Jewry as we sort of think about it, as we think of it.
Right. it's and it becomes like transmogrified in the sense that you already see German, the German Polish split, so to speak, in
Yep.
generality, where the Germans look down now on the Polish Jews.
Yep.
Polish Jews mock the German Jews. There's a good book out by Adam Teller called "Rescue the Surviving Soul," which I just read recently, where he kind of looks into primary sources of Jews during the Khmelnytsky massacres who fled to Germany, who were treated maybe less than the way they wanted to be treated. They felt the Germans were cheap. They didn't treat them as nicely as the Poles treated the German Jews who had fled to Poland during the 30 Years' Wars massacres.
Yeah.
A lot of interesting. Yeah, good.
Yeah, but I've just been writing on developments in the 16th century in Germany. After the series of expulsions after the Black Death, and these expulsions went on for a couple of hundred years, and German Jewry was really weakened. I mean, there were very few institutions, and Polish Jewry really took over. And one of the measures of it is with Isserlis's Mapa to the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, and some German rabbis were very upset with Isserlis insofar as they felt that their traditions, their minhagim, were being lost. And the big kahuna now was Polish Jewry. And while he did and I'm writing actually a book on meat at the moment in German Jewish culture. And while he meat, meat.
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 Looking forward to that.
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about it. But in those sections of Your Idea, where he's talking about Isserlis is talking about Shechita, he does make reference to Yaakov Weil, who was a very important rabbi, 15th century rabbi, who wrote a book on Shechita, which is in fact is still in print and is still sort of a basis for those sorts of practices. It is also true that Isserlis tried to sort of universalize Polish Jewish culture as being the dominant form. And so what it really means is that there was a transition where Ashkenaz, by the way, and just in case people are unaware, I'm sure most people on your channel do know, but just in case, in the Middle Ages, when we talk about Ashkenazim, we're really talking about German Jews. In the same way that when we talk about Sephardim, we're only really talking about Spain and the Iberian Peninsula. Ashkenaz was a place. Ashkenaz was Germany. Ashkenazim were German Jews. And then there was a difference between them and Polish Jews. Then it all became, once Polish Jewry, essentially, by the 16th century, certainly, became the dominant force, and which only grew in demographically and in all sorts of ways. It was universalized, and Ashkenazim were both German Jews and Eastern European Jews. And so I think the influence of those German Jews, and in fact, in the wake of all the expulsions, German Jewry produced all these things that are called Minhagim Bücher, all of these books on the Minhagim that were being lost, actually. It was a salvage project to try and protect those things that were, and German Jewry was very, very divided and localized. There was no such thing as German Jewry per se, and they had Minhagim all over the place. Even if you go to Shul in Germany today, in some Siddurim, it'll have a prayer and it'll say, this prayer is only to be said, south of the Rhine, because the prayer wasn't said, north of it. All these sorts of things, or various regions, from north to south in the country.
I spent about 3 to 4 hours during a morning holiday prayer in Washington Heights section of New York City. Which is
yes.
German Jewish Orthodox congregations left.
Yep.
The davening, the prayer was several hours long, reciting so many different pieces of liturgical poetry, piyutim. And it says on many of them, this was from ancient France. I mean, they kind of gathered in these extinct Minhagim and customs that disappeared. There's no Minhag Tzarfat anymore. It was basically so much valued the value of ancient liturgical prayers that were said by their brethren who lived next to them that they actually took it and kind of adopted them.
Yeah, and actually, let me make one point to that. So you have this among German Jews that I write about in the book, extolling the virtues of Sephardic pronunciation.
Yeah,
German Jews never ever abandoned their own particular form of Ashkenazic pronunciation. There is a German Jewish Hebrew.
Yes.
That was very different from the many different kinds of Polish Jewish Hebrew. There were probably different kinds of German Jewish Hebrew as well, but nonetheless, so they never adopted Sephardic pronunciation,
except for individuals, right?
Some individuals,
Adler,
and
some others, yeah.
Right. He had someone come into his house and live with him for a while to teach him Sephardic. Now, I don't know what that means exactly. I mean, look, and also the idea of one being right, one being wrong. It's as if my English accent is right and yours is wrong, or vice versa. It's ridiculous when we talk about it with other languages. It sounds ridiculous, and I don't know what it would mean. I live with my American wife for all of these years. I still haven't. I don't sound like her, so I don't know what it means that Adler had someone in who taught him how to speak like this. And
if that Americans have an inferiority complex, at least with the British. I don't know if the Australian, when it comes to the accent, they kind of look up.
Right. So a lot of this stuff is sort of mythical. But anyway, we know for a fact that in the end, I mean, there are still some elderly German Jews around. We know how they sounded, what they sounded like, how they pronounced things. And we can actually see it in older Siddurim where there are transliterations. And you can see them say things like Baruch Atau, and it's written A-T-A-U, Baruch Atau, and all sorts of things like that. Right. But anyway, but by the 16th century, the center of gravity in the Ashkenazic world had shifted, and Polish Jewry becomes the great authority. And now German Jews who want to have their children educated, their sons educated, send them to Poland. It doesn't go the other way anymore. The center of religious life becomes Poland, traditional religious life, religious scholarship, and just the power of hundreds and hundreds of thousands, 800,000, nearly a million people by and German Jewry has, at that time, maybe 150,000. I mean, it's apples and oranges. And so all the power resides in Eastern Europe. And so I think that some German Jews in the 16th century, some of the rabbis, 15th, 16th century, were not unjustified in their fears that German Ashkenazic traditions, by Ashkenazic I mean German Jewish traditions, were being lost and were being superseded by the all-powerful Polish Jewish ritual traditions and customs.
Right. So then you have, and Germany never kind of regains that, at least the Orthodox community never regains the luster. And it's right, yeshivot, and none of that. Everything, the center of Ashkenazic life shifts to places like, especially Poland, Russia, Lithuania, the yeshiva world, all that.
That's absolutely true, but I think we also need to recognize and not forget that in this remarkable period of really about 15 to 20 years, really from like let's say 1818, when the first Reformed temple is opened in Hamburg, until the 1830s, German Jewry in short order creates Reformed Judaism, what becomes called conservative Judaism in the United States, and modern Orthodoxy. So it remains, a very, very vibrant and robust religious community, but very, very different from that which happens in Eastern Europe with Hasidism, Misnagdism, and other things like that. So it does, the center of the Jewish world, the Orthodox world shifts, but modern Orthodoxy, emerges in Germany, Reform, what was called positive historical Judaism, which gets called conservative Judaism in the United States. So it remains significantly inventive in religious terms.
Now, and all these communities, interestingly enough, adopts some of the Sephardic, at least exterior forms,
Exactly.
Pronunciation and so on, right?
Exactly. So now you might have like the first, in the humble temple there's a Sephardic chazan who's employed, but when the community responds, they were still responding. When the congregation responded, they were still responding to prayers in German Jewish Hebrew,
right?
Even though the cantor, the chazan, is perhaps singing in Ashkenazic. But then they actually went back later on as the course of the 19th century progressed. And by the 20th century, they were back to having an Ashkenazic, chazan in the temple there.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you said, with the advent of Zionism and the state of Israel, the rebirth of Hebrew, Ben Yehuda champions the Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew over the Ashkenazic. Many of the early Zionists didn't like this, and they actually continued. There were some outliers until recently. Someone told me who would only pronounce modern Hebrew with an Ashkenazic accent. It's kind of comical to hear.
Well,
right?
we know that Bialik's poetry rhymes better, sounds better.
Exactly. That's
in
what
Ashkenazic Hebrew.
Yeah, the Yiddish poet Yehoash, when he came to Rehovot, he said it doesn't sound right to say
it
this.
Doesn't sound right.
The meter is off. So you had a lot of that. By the way, I also want to.
Bialik also said, here's a wonderful expression, and I'll translate it for people, when he said, Meret Loshen Kodesh, aber Yiddish retzich. So you speak Hebrew, but Yiddish speaks itself.
Right. You see the Yiddish oozing out of it.
And it's natural. And so that's exactly what you said about Yehoash saying it doesn't sound right.
It doesn't sound right.
And so the great Hebrew poet Bialik actually used Ashkenazic Hebrew.
But it's so ironic because, you have the champions of the Sephardic culture today saying how their culture has been kind of, taken over and become extinct because of Ashkenazic, overbearing, and they forced all the Israelis of various different origins to kind of assimilate into Ashkenazic melting pot. You see that with the prayer rite of Tzahal, for instance, the religious soldiers of Tzahal. There's a prayer book that kind of tried to combine the Ashkenazic and Sephardic rites into one book. And guess what? As is often the case, neither side are happy. Sephardic claim it's not Sephardic enough. Ashkenazi claim it's not Ashkenazi enough. So these are issues that are still obviously an issue to this day. I want to ask you about reform. I want to talk about there's this notion.
Joel, I can't see you very well. Your camera is tilted. That's better. Yeah.
Much better. Okay. I want to ask you a question about. There's this notion that the reform movement and the other reactionary, I guess, movements that came out as a response to the reform movement, the conservative and others, are strictly an Ashkenazic phenomenon. In other words, it didn't touch the communities of the East, the Near East, or the Sephardic communities in the Balkans and so on, and the Western Sephardic diaspora. Now, obviously, if you take a look into history, that's not true at all. In fact, the first Reformed congregation in the United States was a Sephardic congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, called Kahal Kadosh Bet Elohim. Do you have any thoughts on that? Hello, good morning.
Hi. In the humble temple, there's a Sephardic chazan who's is not. If you listen to the way Mizrahim pronounce Hebrew, and it makes our different accent, even in modern Hebrew in Israel, it's different because the Hebrew that was invented in Israel, also the history of Sephardic Judaism, by which I mean liturgical practices, developments. I mean, I doubt that it was static, just because things